Paper has a memory that human beings do not possess. People forget. People rationalize. People lie to survive. But ink on a ledger, dried and sealed in the humidity of a Georgia summer, it simply remains. It was August 1869. Two men sat in a stifling office in Burke County. One was white, one was black. They were agents of the Bureau, tasked with the autopsy of a dead era. They weren't looking for bodies. They were looking for theft. Not the theft of money, but the theft of lineage. Sarah Hayes sat across from them. She was 36 years old, though her eyes held the exhaustion of a woman twice that age. They pushed a document toward her, a birth certificate, and a medical note written 12 years prior regarding a peculiar marking on an infant's shoulder. A star, dark, 3/4 of an inch. Sarah didn't scream, she didn't cry, she simply stopped breathing, because in that clinical, dry description of a mark on a white child's skin, she saw the unraveling of her entire existence. The child she had nursed, the child she had raised, the child she had served, was not her master's daughter, she was hers. Before we peel back the layers of this deception, I want to welcome you to the autopsy of the Grantham Estate. We document the history that was meant to be burned. If you are listening from the United States, comment below and tell me which state you are watching from. Let us see how far these secrets have traveled. To understand the crime, we must understand the prison. It was 1852. Burke County, Georgia. The earth here is stained red, a mixture of iron and clay that clings to everything. It stains the hem of skirts. It stains boots. It works its way under fingernails until it looks like dried blood. The Grantham plantation was not the largest in the county, but it was the most disciplined. 800 acres, cotton and corn, and at the center of it the main house. 3 stories of white timber, black shutters. Local folklore, whispered by the staff, claimed the shutters were never fully closed. The house was always watching. It was a place of geometry and silence. There were no excesses here, no grand parties, no music spilling out onto the lawn, not anymore. Charles Grantham was 43. A man carved out of grief and arrogance. 3 years prior, he had buried his wife. He had buried his infant son. And with them, he had buried his capacity for joy. He became a creature of the night. He spent his evenings in the study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the smell of expensive whiskey. He didn't read poetry. He read ledgers. He counted. He calculated. He viewed the world not as a collection of souls, but as a series of assets and liabilities. And in the autumn of 1852, he acquired a new asset. Her name was Sarah. She was 19. She came from a bankruptcy auction in Savannah, a piece of liquidated capital from a failed estate near Augusta. She brought 2 things with her, a silence that she wore like armor, and a child growing inside her. The transaction was impersonal, $400. Charles Grantham didn't look at her face. He looked at her utility. A pregnant woman was a 2-fold investment, current labor and future labor. It was a cold, mathematical assessment. The overseer, a man named Porter, whose skin was perpetually peeling from the sun, assigned her to the house, not the fields. Her condition made her unsuited for the cotton rows, but her hands were steady. She was placed under the supervision of Dina. Dina was the head of the household staff, 50 years old, gray-haired. She moved with the economy of someone who knows that wasted energy is dangerous. She looked at Sarah's swollen belly. She didn't smile. "You work until you can't," she said. "Then you rest until you can work again. That is the law of this place." Sarah learned the rhythm of the house quickly. It was a place of invisible boundaries. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not enter the study. Disappear into the wallpaper. Be a ghost. Mr. Grantham required his coffee black, 2 spoons of sugar. He required his shirts starched until they were stiff as cardboard. He required absolute silence when he was reviewing his accounts. Sarah observed him from the periphery. He was a man who seemed to be waiting for something, or perhaps he was planning. January 1853. The winter rains had turned the red clay into a slurry. Sarah went into labor. It lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of agony in a drafty cabin, attended by Dina and an elderly midwife named Ruth. A son, she named him Thomas. For the first time since she was 12 years old, since her own mother had been sold away south, Sarah felt a crack in her armor. She looked at the boy. He was small, helpless, but he was hers. In a world where she owned nothing, not her time, not her labor, not her own body, this small life belonged to her, or so she believed. She returned to work 3 weeks later. Thomas was strapped to her back, lulled by the rhythm of her hoe hitting the earth in the herb garden. Charles Grantham ignored the child. To him, Thomas was an entry in a ledger. Male, healthy. Projected field utility, 1863. He didn't see a son, he saw inventory. 2 years passed. The house remained quiet. Thomas grew. He was sharp-eyed, too observant. Sarah taught him the most important lesson of survival: mask your intelligence. Smart can keep you alive, she whispered to him at night, but showing you're smart can get you killed. Thomas learned to read by studying the discarded newspapers in the kindling box. He learned that words had power, but he also learned that the master of the house was a man who collected things, and soon he would decide to collect a wife. Spring 1855. The silence of the Grantham Estate was shattered. Charles Grantham announced his engagement. Margaret Yancey, 28 years old, the daughter of a judge from Augusta. She arrived with 14 trunks and a nervous disposition. Margaret was beautiful in the way a porcelain vase is beautiful: pale skin, auburn hair, but there was a hairline fracture running through her. Sarah saw it immediately. She recognized the look. It was the look of a startled animal, the look of someone who expects a blow to fall even when the air is still. The wedding was grand, 200 guests. Sarah spent 3 days in the kitchen roasting ducks, glazing cakes, invisible in the steam and heat. She watched through the window as the gentry danced. They looked like a different species, careless. Margaret moved into the main house and the atmosphere shifted. It didn't become warmer, it became brittle. Margaret was not cruel, she was simply absent. She treated Sarah and Dina not as enemies but as furniture. She rearranged the house. She ordered European service. She retreated into her rooms. But the true function of her presence was not domestic. It was biological. Charles Grantham did not need a companion, he needed an heir. A year passed. Margaret announced she was pregnant. The change in Charles Grantham was immediate. The somber widower vanished. He ordered wine from France. He spoke of the future. He spoke of legacy. The child was not just a baby. It was the continuation of the name, the solidification of the estate. But Margaret withered. The pregnancy was a siege on her body, constant nausea, migraines that made her scream if a candle was lit. She spent months in a darkened room, drifting on a cloud of laudanum prescribed by the doctor. She became a ghost in her own home. Sarah continued her work. She cared for Thomas, who was now 4. She mended the linens. She polished the silver. She watched the master pace the hallway outside Margaret's door. He wasn't packing with worry for his wife. He was packing with anxiety for his investment. March 1857. The labor began. It was violent. The screams coming from the upper floor did not sound like the screams of bringing life. They sounded like the screams of someone trying to escape their own skin. Sarah stood in the kitchen listening. She remembered her own pain with Thomas, but this was different. There was a rage in it. 23 hours. The house held its breath. Finally, silence. Then the thin, reedy cry of an infant, a girl. They named her Caroline. But in the master bedroom, something was wrong. Margaret Yancey Grantham refused to look at the child. She refused to hold her. "Get it away from me," she whispered. The doctor called it nervous exhaustion. He prescribed isolation, more laudanum. He removed the child from the room. Charles Grantham was left holding a screaming infant in a cold study. The wet nurse they had hired weeks ago was dead of pneumonia. The baby was hungry. The mother was sedated. The master needed a solution, and the solution was sleeping in a cabin 300 yards away. Sarah was asleep, Thomas curled beside her. A knock on the door, it was Dina. Her face was grim. "Get up," she said. "The master needs you." "Needs me for what?" Sarah asked, clutching her robe. Dina didn't look her in the eye. "The baby needs milk, and you're the only one who has it." Sarah looked at Thomas. She felt a cold dread, a premonition that the world was about to tilt on its axis. She didn't know that she was walking into a trap. She didn't know that the baby screaming in the big house was about to consume her entire life. She stepped onto the porch. The door opened, and Sarah Hayes walked into the dark. The nursery was on the second floor. It was a room Sarah had never entered, a sanctuary of polished wood and expensive lace. When she stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of lavender and the raw, piercing sound of a hunger that would not be denied. Charles Grantham stood by the window. He did not turn around. He simply gestured to the cradle. "Feed her," he said. The command was absolute. It was not a request for help. It was the activation of a tool. Sarah lifted the infant. The baby was light, fragile, her face red and pinched with screaming. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, arranged her robe, and pressed the child to her breast. The crying stopped instantly. The room filled with the rhythmic sound of feeding, a primal silence that felt heavier than the noise. It was in that quiet, under the dim light of a single oil lamp, that Sarah saw it. As she adjusted the blanket, the fabric slipped from the baby's left shoulder. There, stark against the pale skin, was a birthmark, dark, roughly the size of a coin, shaped like a distorted star. Sarah stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. Her own son, Thomas, sleeping in the cabin she had just left, bore a mark almost identical to this one, in the exact same place. For a moment, a thought flickered in her mind, a terrifying, impossible question, but she pushed it away. Coincidences happened, and in the logic of the plantation, looking for connections between the master's blood and the slave's blood was a dangerous game. She covered the mark. She finished the feeding. She didn't know she had just covered the evidence of a crime. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a few weeks, until a wet nurse could be found, but weeks turned into months. Charles Grantham decided it was inefficient for Sarah to travel back and forth from the cabins. It wasted time. It disrupted the schedule. So Sarah was moved. She was given a small room adjacent to the nursery, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the back gardens. It was a promotion in the eyes of the staff. To live in the big house, to sleep under a solid roof, was a privilege. But to Sarah, it was an amputation. Thomas was left behind. He was 4 years old. He was placed in the care of Maddie, an elderly woman who watched the plantation's children while their parents worked the fields. Sarah saw her son only in snatched moments, early mornings before the house woke, or late evenings when she could stand by the kitchen door and watch him playing in the dirt. She watched him grow smaller, not physically but in her life. He was receding like a shoreline as a ship pulls away. One evening she managed to slip out to see him. He stood stiffly, his hands at his sides. "Mama," he whispered, looking at her clean apron, her indoor shoes. "Are you coming back?" "I am here," she said, reaching for him. "I am always here." But she wasn't. She belonged to the nursery now. She belonged to Caroline. And Caroline was relentless. She was a colicky, demanding infant who needed constant motion. Sarah walked the floorboards for hours, humming songs she had once hummed to Thomas. She bathed the child. She soothed the child. And inevitably, treacherously, she began to love the child. It is a cruel trick of biology that the hand that feeds eventually learns to hold. Sarah couldn't help it. She poured her maternal instinct into the vessel that was placed in her arms, leaving nothing for the boy waiting in the cabin. She felt like a thief, stealing affection from her own son to pay a debt to her master's daughter. Meanwhile, the mistress of the house, Margaret Grantham, faded into the wallpaper. She never came to the nursery. She never asked for the child. The maids whispered that she spent her days staring at the ceiling, lost in a chemical fog. The doctor called it melancholia. The staff called it a haunting. When Caroline was 6 months old, the haunting ended. Margaret was found cold in her bed. The empty bottle of laudanum on the nightstand was not an accident. It was a resignation. She had checked out of a life she could no longer endure. Charles Grantham stood at the graveside with dry eyes. He held Caroline, who was sleeping in Sarah's arms just moments before, for the duration of the service, then handed her back immediately after the first shovel of dirt hit the coffin. He didn't need a wife. He had his heir, and he had his servant to ensure the heir survived. The mourning period was brief. The plantation did not pause for grief. Cotton prices were high. The ledger had to be balanced. 2 years later, Charles Grantham married again. Her name was Helen Bradford, a widow from Macon, 41 years old. Practical. Helen was not like Margaret. She was not brittle. She was made of iron and etiquette. She arrived with 3 grown children from a previous marriage and viewed this union as a merger of assets rather than a romance. She walked into the nursery on her second day, looked at Sarah, looked at Caroline, and nodded. "You keep the child clean," she said, "and you keep her quiet. Do that and we will have no trouble." Helen had no interest in mothering. She had done her duty in her previous life. She was here to manage the household accounts, not to rock cradles. But biology has its own schedule. 2 years into the marriage, to everyone's surprise, Helen fell pregnant. It was a functional pregnancy, devoid of the hysteria that had consumed Margaret. Helen delivered twins, a boy and a girl, Robert and Elizabeth. The delivery was quick, the recovery was rapid. But when the time came to feed the infants, Helen simply shook her head. "I have no patience for it," she told her husband, "and we already have a wet nurse in the house." So the burden doubled, or rather it tripled. Sarah was still nursing Caroline, who was 4 years old and refused to be weaned, clinging to Sarah with a desperate, anxious attachment. Now she was handed 2 newborns. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, her body a machine of production. Caroline curled at her feet, the twins at her breast. She was sustaining 3 white lives, draining herself until she felt like a husk. Thomas, now 9 years old, came to the main house one evening to deliver a basket of kindling. He stopped in the doorway of the nursery. He saw the tableau. His mother, surrounded by the master's children. The intimacy of it. The tenderness in her hands as she wiped the milk from the baby's mouth. A tenderness he hadn't felt in years. Sarah looked up. She saw him. "Thomas," she said softly. He didn't step into the room. He stood on the threshold, understanding the geography of his world. "You have 3 children now," he said. His voice was flat. "Old. White children. It must be nice, Mama, to have children that matter." "Thomas, no." Sarah tried to stand, but the bobbies were heavy, and Caroline was clinging to her skirt. She was anchored by them, trapped by the very care she was forced to give. Thomas turned and walked away. The sound of his bare feet retreating down the hallway was quieter than the breathing of the twins, but to Sarah, it sounded like a door slamming shut forever. She didn't know that the cruelty was just beginning. She didn't know that the war was coming, and she certainly didn't know that the child clinging to her skirt, the child she was raising to be a lady of the South, was carrying her own blood. The years began to blur. The South was holding its breath, waiting for the cannon fire. But inside the nursery, the war was silent. It was a war of identity, and Sarah was losing ground every single day. It is often said that time heals all wounds. This is a lie. Time does not heal. It merely scars tissue over the injury. It calcifies the damage, preserving it under layers of routine and silence until the wound is no longer an event, but a part of the anatomy. The years between 1857 and 1861 were years of calcification at the Grantham Estate. The plantation operated with the rhythmic, grinding efficiency of a mill. Cotton was planted. Cotton was harvested. The ledgers were balanced. And in the nursery, 3 children grew under the watchful, weary eyes of a woman who was mother to all and mother to none. Caroline grew into a creature of sunlight and silk. She was the estate's prized orchid, cultivated in the greenhouse of the main house. By age 4, she had a tutor. By age 6, she had a pony. She was a child of laughter and easy affection. Calling Sarah Mammy, with a sweetness that curdled in Sarah's stomach like spoiled milk. Because every time Sarah brushed Caroline's hair that was dark and thick, insisting on curling in ways that required constant tamming, she saw the ghost of the life that should have been. And then there was Thomas. If Caroline was the orchid, Thomas was the weed growing through the cracks in the pavement, hardy, stubborn, and unwanted. He was banished to the fields as soon as he was strong enough to hold a hoe. Sarah watched him from the nursery window. She saw his shoulders broaden. She saw the skin on his hands thicken and crack. She saw the light in his eyes dim, replaced by a guarded, simmering resentment. He was the shadow that the house cast, and shadows by their nature are silent. When they did meet, usually in the rushed, stolen moments of Sunday evenings, the silence between them was deafening. Thomas would sit on the edge of her narrow bed, smelling of earth and sweat, looking at her clean apron, her indoor hands. He looked at her as if she were a collaborator, a traitor who had chosen the comfort of the oppressor's children over the suffering of her own. "She asked for you today," Thomas said once, his voice barely a whisper. He was 10 years old. "Maddie, she asked where you were." "I was working, Thomas. You know I was working." "You were playing," he corrected. "I saw you in the garden. You were playing hide and seek with her." "It is my job," Sarah pleaded, reaching for his hand. He pulled it away. "It looks like love," he said. "From where I'm standing, it looks a lot like love." Sarah had no answer for him because he was right. It was love. That was the horror of it. She loved Caroline. She loved the child who had latched onto her breast and never let go. She loved the way Caroline ran to her when she scraped her knee, bypassing her father, bypassing Helen, coming straight to the arms that had held her since birth. Sarah was trapped in a prison of her own affection, forced to nurture the very thing that separated her from her son. Then the sky broke open. April 1861. The news arrived via a rider on a sweating horse. Fort Sumter, the war. The atmosphere in the house shifted from cold efficiency to a fevered delirium. Charles Grantham did not enlist. He was too old, too valuable as a provider of goods, but he became a general of logistics. The plantation ceased to be a home and became a factory for the Confederacy. The corn was no longer for market. It was for the troops. The horses were requisitioned. The war was a distant thunder at first, a rumble on the horizon that rattled the teacups but did not break them. But slowly, the rot set in. The blockade starved the ports. The luxury of the main house began to fray. There was no more French wine. There was no more imported silk. The coffee became a bitter slurry of roasted chicory and acorns. Helen Bradford Grantham, the mistress of iron and etiquette, began to rust. She paced the halls, wringing her hands, terrified of a future she couldn't control. She took her anxiety out on the staff, her voice rising in shrill, jagged peaks. She looked at the twins, Robert and Elizabeth, with a frantic possessiveness, as if she could shield them from the cannon fire by sheer will. But she didn't look at Caroline. Caroline was safe. Caroline was the golden child, immune to the decay, or so they thought. Sarah watched the decline with a detached, clinical eye. She saw the paint peeling on the pillars. She saw the weeds creeping into the flower beds as the field hands were conscripted or ran off to the Union lines. The illusion of permanence was shattering. The Grantham Estate was not a fortress. It was a stage set, and the curtain was falling. In 1864, the war arrived on their doorstep, not in the form of a battle, but in the form of Sherman. The army was moving toward the sea, a leviathan of fire and smoke. They didn't pass directly through Burke County, but the fear of them did. The air smelled of burning pine. Refugees clogged the roads, wagons piled high with furniture, women weeping in the dust. Charles Grantham buried the family's silver in the woods. He hid the livestock in the swamp. He sat in his study with a loaded pistol on the desk, waiting for an enemy that, in the end, passed them by. But the world had ended nonetheless. April 1865, Appomattox, the surrender. The news didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper, a rumor that passed from plantation to plantation, carried by the wind, carried by the invisible telegraph of the enslaved. We are free. Charles Grantham called them to the front porch. 63 people, the remnants of his workforce. They stood in the dirt yard, looking up at the man who had owned their bodies, their time, their children. He looked gray. He looked smaller than Sarah had ever seen him. "You are free," he said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "The war is over. The law has changed. You may go, or you may stay and work for wages. $7 a month, room and board." Silence. It was not a cheer. It was a vacuum. The people stood there trying to comprehend the geometry of a world without walls. Freedom is a terrifying concept when you have been kept in a cage for generations. Where do you go? How do you eat? Who are you, if not property? Sarah stood at the back of the crowd. She felt Thomas's hand brush against hers. He was 16 now, tall, strong. His eyes were burning with a light that frightened her. "We're going," he whispered. "Mama, we're going tonight." Sarah looked at him. Then she looked up at the porch. She saw Charles Grantham. She saw Helen. And standing between them, looking terrified and confused, was Caroline. Caroline was 8 years old. She was clutching a doll Sarah had made for her out of corn husks. She looked at Sarah, her eyes wide, pleading, searching for the only safety she had ever known. If Sarah left, Caroline would be alone with a cold father and an indifferent stepmother. If Sarah left, the child she had raised would be abandoned. The biological tether, the invisible cord that bound Sarah to that white child, pulled tight. It choked her. "I can't," Sarah whispered. Thomas froze. He turned to her slowly. "What did you say?" "I can't go, Thomas, not yet. She needs me." Thomas looked at the porch. He looked at Caroline. Then he looked back at his mother and his face crumbled. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a profound, devastating disappointment. "She ain't yours, Mama," he said, his voice breaking. "Why do you keep forgetting that? She is theirs. I am yours. Why ain't I enough?" "You are," Sarah sobbed, reaching for him. "You are my heart, Thomas, but she is helpless." "And I was helpless too," Thomas said, "and you let me go." He didn't scream, he didn't argue, he simply turned around. He walked to the cabin. He packed his single canvas bag. He walked past the main house, past the weeping willow, past the gate. He didn't look back. Sarah watched him go until he was nothing but a speck of dust on the red road to Savannah. She felt a tearing inside her chest, a physical ripping of muscle and spirit. She had chosen. God help her, she had chosen the master's child over her own son. She didn't know, she couldn't know, that she had actually chosen her daughter over her son. She thought she was a traitor. She didn't know she was a mother protecting the child who needed her most. The years of Reconstruction were a slow, agonizing funeral for the Old South. The Grantham Estate did not recover. It rotted. The labor force shrank from 63 to 5. The fields went fallow, overtaken by briars and kudzu. The money was gone. Confederate dollars were used to kindle the fire in the kitchen stove. Charles Grantham aged rapidly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a bitter, simmering rage. He sat on the porch, staring at the overgrown lawn, muttering about the Yankees, about the betrayal, about the end of civilization. Helen pawned her jewelry in Augusta. The diamonds went first, then the pearls, then the silver teapots. They lived in the shell of their former glory, eating cornbread on china plates, pretending they were still royalty in a kingdom that had dissolved. Sarah stayed. She worked for wages now, $7 a month, but the dynamic had not truly changed. She was still the engine that kept the household running. She cooked. She cleaned. She mended the curtains that were falling apart from rot. And she raised the children. Caroline, Robert, and Elizabeth grew up in this decaying world, unaware that they were living in a ruin. The twins, Robert and Elizabeth, were their father's children. They absorbed his bitterness like a sponge absorbs water. They were 11 years old in 1867, and they were already cruel. They spoke to the remaining black staff with a sneering condescension, mimicking the authority they thought was their birthright. "Boy," Robert would call to the elderly gardener, a man 3 times his age, "fetch my boots." And Sarah would bite her tongue, her hands shaking as she scrubbed the floor, praying for patience. But Caroline was different. She was 12, then 13, then 14. She possessed a natural grace that seemed out of place in the grim, dusty house. She was kind. She read voraciously books from the library, poetry, history. She played the piano, though the instrument was out of tune and the ivory keys were yellowing. She treated Sarah not as a servant, but as a confidant, a companion. "Mammy," she would say, sitting in the kitchen while Sarah peeled potatoes, "read to me, please." "I have work, Miss Caroline." "Just a page. I love the way you do the voices." And Sarah would relent. She would read. She would brush Caroline's hair. She would let Caroline rest her head on her shoulder. And in those moments, the lie felt almost like the truth. It felt like a mother and daughter sitting in a kitchen, safe from the world. But then Robert would walk in, or Helen would ring the bell, and the illusion would shatter. Miss Caroline's servant, white, black. The walls would slam back into place. Letters arrived from Savannah. Thomas wrote. He was alive. He was working on the docks. He was learning to be a clerk. His letters were brief, factual, and addressed formally to Mrs. Sarah Hayes. He never asked about the family. He never asked about Caroline. Sarah kept the letters in a tin box under her bed. She read them until the paper was soft as cloth. She cried over them in the dark, mourning the son who had made a life without her, a life she was not welcome to enter. One afternoon, Caroline found Sarah reading one of these letters. "Who is that from?" Caroline asked, leaning against the doorframe. She was 16 now, beautiful, the image of her mother, Margaret, or so everyone said, the pale skin, the dark hair, the green eyes. Sarah folded the letter quickly. "It is from my son, Thomas." Caroline blinked. "Your son?" The question hung in the air, heavy and absurd. "Yes, Miss Caroline, my son." I didn't know you had a son." Sarah looked at this girl, this intelligent, well-read, kind-hearted girl, and felt a surge of anger so sudden and hot it almost choked her. "You grew up with him," Sarah said, her voice tight. "He lived in the cabin behind the kitchen. You played in the same yard." Caroline frowned, searching her memory. "The boy, the one who brought the wood." "His name is Thomas." "I didn't know he was yours," Caroline said. She sounded genuinely confused. I suppose I never thought about who his mother was. I just thought he was here. I just thought he was here. Like a tree, like a fence post, like a piece of furniture." That was the insidious nature of the system. It didn't just enslave the body, it erased the humanity of the connections. To Caroline, Thomas had been background noise. To Sarah, he was the center of the universe. "He lives in Savannah now," Sarah said, tucking the letter into her apron. "He is a free man." "That's nice," Caroline said, losing interest. "Mammy, can you fix the hem on my blue dress? I want to wear it for dinner." Sarah looked at her. She looked at the daughter who didn't know she was a daughter. She looked at the girl who could dismiss a mother's heartbreak with a request for a hemline. "Yes, Miss Caroline," Sarah said, "I will fix it." This was the torture of the post-war years. It wasn't the whip. It wasn't the chains. It was the daily, grinding erasure. It was serving a child who loved you but did not see you. It was loving a child who, by her very existence, denied your own. 1868 turned into 1869. Caroline announced she wanted to go to seminary in Macon to study literature and music. Charles Grantham balked at the cost, but Helen insisted. "She must be marriageable," Helen argued. "We have no dowry. She must have accomplishments. If she stays here, she will rot along with this house. So the money was found. Land was sold. Another 50 acres of the ancestors' earth traded for tuition. The night before she left, Caroline came to Sarah's room. The room adjacent to the nursery. The same room where Sarah had spent 17 years. Caroline sat on the edge of the bed. She looked young, frightened. "I'm scared, Mammy," she whispered. "You will be fine," Sarah said, folding Caroline's clothes into a trunk. "You are smart, you are strong. I feel like I'm leaving the only safe place in the world." Sarah stopped. She looked at the peeling wallpaper, the drafty window, the poverty. This was not a safe place. It was a graveyard, but to Caroline it was home. "You are going to build a life," Sarah said. "A real life, not a ghost life like we have here." Caroline stood up. She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged Sarah. It was a tight, desperate hug. "I love you, Mammy," she said into Sarah's shoulder. "You're the only mother I've ever really known. Margaret, she was just a painting in the hall. You were the one who was there." Sarah stood frozen. Her hands hovered over the girl's back, then slowly, tentatively, settled on her shoulders. She smelled the lavender soap. She felt the warmth of the living body she had created. "I love you too, child," Sarah whispered. It was the truth, and it was the lie. She loved her as a servant loves a mistress. She loved her as a mother loves a daughter. The two loves fought in her chest, tangling like vines, choking the breath out of her. Caroline left the next morning. The carriage rattled down the driveway, kicking up a cloud of red dust. The house fell silent. Totally, completely silent. The twins were away at school in Augusta. Helen was in her room with a migraine. Charles was in the fields, staring at the dirt. Sarah was alone. For the first time in 17 years, she had no one to nurse, no one to rock, no one to serve. She walked through the empty nursery. She touched the crib that was now used for storage. She touched the rocking chair. She felt a phantom weight in her arms, the ghost of an infant, the ghost of a choice. And then the letter came. August 1869. It wasn't a letter from Thomas. It wasn't a letter from Caroline. It was a government envelope, official, heavy. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It was addressed to Charles Grantham, but the courier had handed it to Sarah at the back door. She held it in her hands. She felt the texture of the paper. She didn't open it. She would never dare. But she placed it on the silver tray and carried it to the study. She knocked. "Enter." Charles Grantham was sitting at his desk. He looked up, his eyes bleary with whiskey. "A letter, sir." He took it. He tore it open with a trembling hand. Sarah waited. She was supposed to leave, but something rooted her to the floor. She watched him read. She saw the color drain from his face. She saw the paper shake. She saw him look up past her, through her, at something terrifying in the distance. "The records," he muttered. "They want the records." He looked at Sarah. For a second he really saw her. He looked at her face. He looked at her eyes, and in that look Sarah saw a flash of panic. "Get out," he whispered. "Sir." "Get out," he roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "Get out of my sight." Sarah fled. She went back to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't know what was in the letter. She didn't know that the Bureau was conducting a census of displaced families. She didn't know that they were cross-referencing birth records with plantation ledgers to help freedmen find their lost kin. She didn't know that the ink on the ledger, the ink that remembered what people wanted to forget, was about to speak. She stood at the sink, plunging her hands into the cold water. She looked out the window at the empty yard where Thomas used to play. She looked at the road where Caroline had left. She felt the storm coming. Not a storm of rain and wind, but a storm of paper and truth. The silence of the Grantham Estate was about to be broken, and the sound of the breaking would be loud enough to shatter the world. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. But deep down, in the blood that sang in her veins, she knew that the reckoning had finally arrived. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was waiting in the hallway, holding a ledger, ready to knock on the door. 3 days passed between the arrival of the letter and the arrival of the men. 3 days of a silence so heavy it felt like the house was holding its breath underwater. Charles Grantham did not leave his study. He did not eat. The trays Sarah left outside his door remained untouched, the soup congealing, the bread turning stale. He was a man fortifying himself against a siege, but the enemy was not outside the gates with cannons. The enemy was ink and paper, and the accumulation of his own history. On the morning of the third day, a carriage arrived. It was not the elegant carriage of the pre-war gentry, nor the battered wagon of a farmer. It was a government vehicle, severe, black, utilitarian. 2 men stepped out. Agent Collins was white, young, with the pinched face of a man who spent his life looking for errors in columns of figures. Agent Freeman was black, older, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen the worst of what this country could do to a human body. He carried a leather satchel that looked heavy, weighed down not by metal, but by the gravity of its contents. Sarah watched from the kitchen window. She felt a vibration in the floorboards, a tremor that had nothing to do with the earth and everything to do with fate. Dina stood beside her, wiping her hands on a rag. "Those are the bureau men," Dina whispered. "They say they are here to help families find each other, but they look like they are here to dig graves." They didn't dig graves. They dug through the library. They requisitioned the study, displacing Charles Grantham from his own desk. For 2 days, the door remained closed. The only sounds were the murmuring of low voices and the rustle of pages turning. Thousands of pages. Ledgers that recorded the sale of cotton, the purchase of seed, the birth of livestock, and the birth of human beings. Sarah went about her work with a mechanical numbness. She polished the silver. She swept the hallway. She tried to make herself invisible, a ghost in the periphery of the investigation. But she felt the pull of that room. She felt the ledgers calling out, their spines cracking open to release the secrets they had held for 17 years. On the afternoon of the second day, the door opened. Agent Freeman stepped out. He didn't look at Charles Grantham, who was sitting in a chair in the hallway, looking diminished and gray. He looked past him. He looked down the hall, past the portraits of ancestors who were now just oil paint on rotting canvas, straight to the kitchen door. "Sarah Hayes," he said. "It wasn't a question, it was a summons." Sarah wiped her hands. She walked down the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her feet, a sound she had heard 1,000,000 times, but today it sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to 0. She stepped into the study. The air smelled of stale tobacco, dust, and the sharp, acidic scent of old paper. Agent Collins was standing by the window. He looked uncomfortable. Agent Freeman sat behind the massive oak desk, the desk where Charles Grantham had once decided the fate of 63 souls. Now, a black man sat in the chair, and the world had turned upside down. "Please sit down, Mrs. Hayes," Freeman said. Mrs. Hayes. The honorific felt strange on her skin. She sat on the edge of the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "We are conducting a review of the plantation records," Freeman began, his voice low and steady. "Specifically, the records pertaining to births and parentage during the years 1850 to 1860. We are cross-referencing these with county medical filings." Sarah nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. Freeman opened a large, leather-bound book. It was the plantation ledger. Sarah recognized it. She had seen it on this desk for years, a forbidden object, the Book of Judgment. Freeman turned the pages with a reverence that was almost religious. He stopped at a page near the beginning. "I need you to verify some entries for me," he said. He spun the book around. "Can you read, Mrs. Hayes?" "Yes, sir." "Read this entry, here." He pointed a finger at a line written in confident, flowing script. Sarah leaned forward. The ink was brown, faded but legible. September 1852, purchase. One female, Sarah, age 19, condition pregnant, source, Dalton Estate auction. Price, $400. Sarah looked at the words. She saw herself reduced to a single line of accounting. "That is me," she whispered. Freeman nodded. He turned the page. And this. January 14, 1853. Delivered of male child. Name, Thomas. Healthy. Retained for future labor. "That is my son," Sarah said. The grief of Thomas's departure, the ache of his absence flared hot in her chest. "That is Thomas." "Good." Freeman closed that ledger and placed it to the side. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a different document. This one was not a private ledger. It was an official government form bearing the seal of Burke County. It was yellowed, the edges curling. "Now, Mrs. Hayes, this is where the record becomes complicated." He laid the document on the desk. "This is the birth certificate filed for Caroline Margaret Grantham, dated April 1857. Sarah looked at it. She saw the name, Caroline, the name she had whispered in the dark to soothe a crying infant, the name she had called out across the lawn 1,000 times. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "What does Miss Caroline's birth record have to do with me?" Freeman didn't answer immediately. He looked at Agent Collins, who was staring out the window at the overgrown garden, refusing to meet Sarah's eyes. Freeman reached into the file again and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, scrawled in hasty, jagged handwriting. "This," Freeman said, "is a private note from the attending physician, Dr. William Patterson. It was attached to the original filing but was never meant to be part of the public record. We found it in the county archives, misfiled, or perhaps hidden." He unfolded it. He placed it next to the birth certificate. "Read the bottom section, Mrs. Hayes, the section labeled Physical Distinctions." Sarah looked. The handwriting was cramped, difficult to decipher. She squinted. "Infant bears distinct pigmentation mark on left shoulder, irregular shape, dark, resembles star pattern, size approx 3/4 inch." Sarah stopped reading. The air in the room seemed to vanish. The walls of the study seemed to tilt inward. A star, a dark star on the left shoulder. "Mrs. Hayes," Freeman's voice sounded very far away. "Did you ever notice a mark like that on Caroline Grantham?" Sarah's mind was reeling backward, spinning through time like a wheel coming off an axle. She was back in the nursery. It was 1857. The lamplight was dim. The baby was screaming. She was opening her robe. The blanket slipped. The shoulder, the mark. She had seen it. She had touched it. And she had seen it before. "Thomas," she whispered. The word fell out of her mouth like a stone. "Thomas has that mark." "Yes," Freeman said softly. "He does. We spoke to Thomas in Savannah 2 days ago. We examined him. The mark is identical. It is a hereditary hyperpigmentation, extremely rare and unmistakable." Sarah looked up at Freeman. Her eyes were wide, blind with shock. But Margaret, Mrs. Grantham, she gave birth. I heard her screaming. I heard her screaming for 20 hours. "You heard a woman screaming," Freeman corrected gently. "But did you see the child come out of her body?" "No, I was in the kitchen." "We have the doctor's journal," Freeman said. He tapped a third book, a smaller one, black and worn. Dr. Patterson was a man who kept meticulous notes of his sins. Margaret Grantham was not pregnant, Mrs. Hayes. She was infertile. She had suffered 6 miscarriages. Her mind was fragile. When she failed to conceive again, Charles Grantham devised a plan. He needed an heir, and he had a pregnant slave whose delivery date coincided with his wife's phantom pregnancy. Sarah shook her head. No, that's impossible. I was pregnant. I delivered Thomas." "You delivered Thomas in 1853, Freeman said. "But you were pregnant again in 1857, were you not?" Sarah froze. The memory was there, buried under layers of trauma and deliberate forgetting. 1857, the winter, she had been sick. She had been heavy with child, but the baby had died. My baby died, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I delivered a girl, she was stillborn. Dr. Patterson told me. He took her away before I could hold her. He said she was fevered. He said it was dangerous to touch the body. They buried her in the woods. Freeman looked at her with a profound, aching sadness. There is no grave in the woods, Sarah. There never was. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a universe shattering. Sarah looked at the ledger. She looked at the birth certificate. She looked at the doctor's note. The pieces slammed together with the violence of a train wreck. The stillborn daughter. The frantic summons to the big house 3 weeks later. The wet nurse duty. The baby who latched onto her with a hunger that felt familiar. The birthmark. He stole her, Sarah whispered. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a realization so horrific it felt like physical pain. He took my baby from between my legs while I was half-conscious with pain. He told me she was dead, and then he handed her back to me and made me serve her. She stood up. The chair fell over backward with a crash. He made me a servant to my own flesh and blood, she screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, raw and animal. He made me mourn her while I was holding her. He made me choose her over Thomas. He made me raise my daughter to think she was white, to think she was better than me, to think I was nothing but a cow to give her milk. Agent Collins turned from the window, looking alarmed. Mrs. Hayes, please. Don't you shush me, Sarah turned on him, her eyes blazing. You don't get to tell me to be quiet, not about this. 17 years. 17 years I wiped her tears and brushed her hair and called her Miss Caroline and hated myself for loving her. And she was mine. She was mine the whole time. Freeman stood up. He walked around the desk. He didn't try to calm her. He simply stood witness to her rage. It is a crime, he said. It is fraud. It is kidnapping. It is a violation of natural law, and we have the proof. Sarah was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her sanity together. She thought of Thomas. Oh God, Thomas. She had sent him away. She had let him walk to Savannah alone because she couldn't leave Caroline. She had sacrificed her son for her daughter, thinking she was sacrificing him for her job. And Thomas had known, not the facts but the feeling. She isn't yours, Mama, but she was. And the tragedy was that neither of them knew it. Where is he? Sarah asked. Her voice was dangerous, low. Where is Charles Grantham? He is in the parlor, Freeman said. We told him to wait. I want to see him. Mrs. Hayes, legally, we are building a case, Collins began. I don't care about your case, Sarah snapped. I care about the man who stole my life. I want to see him now. She didn't wait for permission. She turned and walked out of the study. She didn't walk like a servant this time. She didn't walk with her head down, hugging the wall. She walked down the center of the hallway, her footsteps heavy, striking the floorboards like a gavel. She found him in the parlor. Charles Grantham was sitting in his favorite wingback chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, his face held the old expression, the imperious, annoyed look of a master whose privacy has been invaded. But then he saw her eyes, and the expression crumbled. He looked old, he looked terrified. Sarah, he said, his voice was a rasp. Don't you say my name, she said. She stood over him. She was smaller than him, a woman worn down by labor, but in this moment she towered over him like an avenging angel. Don't you dare speak my name with the same mouth that told me my baby was dead. Grantham's hand shook, the ice in his glass rattling. It was necessary, he whispered. The estate, the legacy, Margaret couldn't. You stole a person, Sarah said. You didn't steal money, you didn't steal land, you stole a human being. You looked at my grief, a mother grieving her dead child, and you used it. You used my milk to feed the child you stole from me. How? How does a man have a soul that black and still sleep at night? I gave her a good life, Grantham said, a sudden desperate defensiveness entering his voice. Look at her, Sarah. She is educated, she is refined, she is a lady. If I had left her with you, what would she be? A field hand, a washerwoman. I gave her the world." "You gave her a lie," Sarah screamed. "You gave her a life built on sand. And what happens now, Charles? What happens when the world finds out who she really is? What happens to your precious lady when the law says she is colored? You didn't save her. You set her up to be destroyed." Grantham flinched. He knew. He knew the laws of Georgia. He knew the one-drop rule. He knew that by making her his heir, he had elevated her, but by hiding her lineage, he had doomed her to a fall that would be catastrophic. "Does she know?" Sarah asked. The anger drained away, leaving a cold, hard resolve. Grantham shook his head. "No, she is in Macon. She doesn't know." "She has to know," Sarah said. "No," Grantham pleaded. He stood up, reaching out a hand. "Sarah, please let it be. The war is over. The past is done. Why destroy her life now? Why take everything from her if you love her, if you truly love her? Let her be Caroline Grantham. Let her have the future I bought for her." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the man who had bought her for $400. She looked at the man who thought that love meant ownership, that a good life meant a white life. She thought of Thomas, working on the docks in Savannah, knowing who he was. She thought of Caroline, sitting in a parlor in Macon, playing the piano, living inside a bubble that was about to burst. "I do love her," Sarah said quietly. "I loved her enough to raise her when I thought she was yours. I loved her enough to stay when I should have run. But I love her too much to let her live a lie. Because a lie isn't a life, Charles, it's a cage. And you've kept us in cages long enough." She turned her back on him. She walked out of the parlor, leaving him standing in the ruin of his own making. She walked back to the study where the agents were waiting. "Mrs. Hayes?" Freeman asked. Sarah stood in the doorway. She felt lightheaded, but her vision was clear, clearer than it had been in 17 years. "I want to send a telegram," she said, "to Savannah, to my son." "You want Thomas to come here?" Freeman asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "He needs to be here. He needs to see the records. He needs to know that his mother didn't abandon him for a white girl. He needs to know he has a sister." "And Caroline?" Collins asked. "What about her?" Sarah looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the overgrown fields. "Bring her home," Sarah said. "Bring her here. We are going to finish this. We are going to put the truth on the table, and we are going to see who is strong enough to pick it up." The decision was made. The silence was broken. The autopsy was over. Now the inquest would begin. Sarah Hayes went back to her room, the room next to the nursery, and sat on the bed. She touched her own left shoulder, tracing the skin where the star would be if she were the one marked. She wasn't marked by pigment. She was marked by history. But for the first time, the mark didn't feel like a brand. It felt like a map. And she knew exactly where she had to go. The telegram reached Savannah in 6 hours. It reached Thomas Hayes in the cramped, salt-smelling office of the shipping clerk where he worked. He read the words twice. "Come home. Urgent. The truth is out. Sarah." He didn't ask for permission to leave. He simply took his hat and walked out the door. He boarded the evening train west, watching the marshlands dissolve into the red clay of the interior, feeling the rhythmic clacking of the wheels like a countdown. He arrived at the Grantham Estate 2 days later. The gates were open, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The weeds in the driveway were waist-high. Thomas walked up the long avenue of oaks, the same walk he had made in the opposite direction 4 years earlier. He expected to feel the old anger, the burning resentment of the boy who had been left behind. But as the house came into view, peeling paint, shuttered windows, looking like a skull bleaching in the sun, he felt only a cold, grim curiosity. Sarah met him on the porch. She looked different. The deference was gone from her posture. She stood with her spine straight, her hands at her sides, no longer hidden in an apron. She didn't hug him immediately. She looked at him, searching his face, seeing the man who had grown out of the boy. "You look like your father," she said. It was the first time she had ever acknowledged his paternity out loud. "I hope not," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Not him," Sarah said quietly. "My husband, the man who was sold away before you were born, you have his eyes." She took him inside, not to the kitchen, not to the cabins. She took him to the study. Agent Freeman was there. The ledgers were there. And when Thomas was told the truth, when the papers were laid out, when the timeline was explained, when the theft of his sister was revealed, he didn't shout. He sat in the leather chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at the floor. "I hated her," he whispered finally. "All those years, I hated her because she had you, I thought. I thought you loved her because she was white, because she was clean, because she was everything I wasn't." "I loved her because she was mine," Sarah said, sitting beside him. "And I didn't even know it. My body knew, my heart knew, but my head believed the lie." Thomas looked up. There were tears in his eyes, hot and angry. "So she's my sister, my full sister?" "Yes." "And she doesn't know?" "Not yet." Sarah said, "She arrives from Macon tomorrow." The waiting was the hardest part. The house felt like a bomb that had been armed, the fuse hissing in the walls. Charles Grantham remained in his room, refusing to come out, a prisoner in his own kingdom. The agents worked in the study, preparing the legal brief. Sarah and Thomas sat in the kitchen, drinking chicory coffee, trying to learn how to be a family again across the chasm of 17 years of secrets. Caroline arrived in the late afternoon. The carriage pulled up. The driver unloaded her trunk. She stepped out, wearing a blue traveling dress, looking fresh and innocent, a flower that had no idea it was growing in a graveyard. She walked up the steps. She saw Sarah. She smiled, that easy, affectionate smile of a girl who has never doubted her place in the world. "Mammy," she called out, "I'm home. The train was dreadful, so much dust." She stopped. She saw Thomas standing behind Sarah. She saw the two strange men, Agent Freeman and Agent Collins, standing in the doorway of the study. She saw the look on Sarah's face. It wasn't the look of a servant welcoming a mistress. It was the look of a woman watching an execution. "What is it?" Caroline asked, her smile faltering. "Is it father? Is he ill?" "Come inside, Caroline," Sarah said. She didn't say Miss Caroline. The omission hung in the air, heavy and strange. They went to the study, the room where it had all begun. Caroline sat in the chair where her mother had sat days before. She looked small, surrounded by the men, surrounded by the weight of the evidence. Agent Freeman did the talking. He was gentle, but he was precise. He laid out the facts like bricks, building a wall around her. The miscarriages, the fake pregnancy, the purchase of Sarah, the birth dates, the bribe paid to the doctor. Caroline listened. Her face grew pale, then flushed, then pale again. She shook her head, a reflexive, jerky motion. "No," she said, that's a story. That's a Gothic novel. That isn't real. My mother was Margaret Grantham. I have her eyes. Everyone says I have her eyes." "You have your father's eyes," Sarah said softly. "My first husband. He had green eyes just like yours. It's rare, but it happens." Caroline turned to her. There was panic in her voice now. "Mammy, stop it, please. Tell them they're wrong. Tell them who I am." "I can't tell them who you were," Sarah said. "I can only tell them who you are." Sarah stepped forward. She reached for the collar of her own dress. She unbuttoned the top button and pulled the fabric down, exposing her left shoulder. There on the dark skin was a patch of darker pigment, a star, distorted, irregular, but unmistakable. "Show them," Sarah said. Caroline froze. Her hand went to her own shoulder, clutching the blue silk of her dress. "No," she whispered. "Show them," Thomas said. His voice was harsh but not cruel. It was the voice of a brother demanding the truth. "Stop hiding." Slowly, with trembling fingers, Caroline undid her collar. She pulled the fabric aside. The skin was pale, creamy white, but on the curve of the shoulder, stark as ink on parchment, was the mark. The room went silent. Sarah stood next to her, mother and daughter, black and white. The skin colors were different, but the blood spoke through the mark. It was the same star, the same map. Caroline stared at Sarah's shoulder, then at her own. She looked at Thomas, and for the first time she really looked at him. She saw the shape of his jaw, the set of his brow. She saw her own face reflected in a dark mirror. The scream didn't come out as a sound. It came out as a gasp, a sudden intake of air as the world collapsed. She started, but she couldn't finish. "You are my daughter," Sarah said. "You are Caroline Hayes." "I'm black," Caroline whispered. The realization wasn't a biological fact to her, it was a social death sentence. In 1869 Georgia, it was the end of the world. If this is true, I am not who I thought I was. I am nothing. "You are not nothing," Thomas snapped. "You are us. Is that nothing to you? Is being one of us so terrible that you'd rather be a lie?" Caroline looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she sobbed. I don't know how to be this. I don't know how to be you. I was raised to be a lady." "You were raised to be a thief," Thomas said. "You stole my mother, you stole my life, and you didn't even know you were doing it." "Thomas, enough," Sarah said. She reached out and took Caroline's hand. Caroline flinched, instinctively pulling back, then stopped. She looked at Sarah's hand, rough, work-worn, dark, holding her own soft, manicured, pale hand. The connection was electric. It was terrifying, but it held. "I need to speak to him," Caroline said. Her voice was shaking, but there was steel in it. "I need to hear him say it." She went to Charles Grantham's room. She didn't knock. She threw the door open. The man who had been her father for 18 years was sitting by the window, staring at the overgrown lawn. He looked up. He saw her face, ruined by crying, and he knew. "Caroline," he said, reaching out. "My dear." "Don't," she said. She stayed in the doorway. "Did you buy me?" Charles winced. I arranged for your future. I saved you." "Did you buy me?" "I took you in. I loved you." "Did you steal me from her?" Caroline pointed back toward the hall, toward Sarah. "Did you take me from her arms and make her my servant?" Charles slumped in his chair. "She was a slave, Caroline. She had no rights. I gave you a name. I gave you an inheritance. I made you a Grantham." "You made me a fraud," Caroline screamed. "You let me treat my own mother like a pet. You let me treat my own brother like a stranger. You watched me do it. You watched me every day, and you never said a word. You let me live inside a sin." "I did it for you." "You did it for yourself," she countered. "You did it for your name. You did it because your wife was barren and you were too proud to let the line die. You used us. You used all of us. And now I don't even know what I am." "You are my daughter," Charles said desperately. "The law, the blood, it doesn't matter. I raised you." "The law matters," Caroline said bitterly. "You know it does. You know what happens when they find out. You know what I become." She turned and walked away. She left him reaching out to empty air. She walked back to the kitchen, where Sarah was waiting. She sat down at the rough wooden table. She put her head in her hands. "What do I do?" she asked. "Mammy, mother, what do I do?" Sarah sat across from her. "You choose. You can walk out that door, go back to Macon, and pretend this never happened. You can marry a white man and live a white life and carry this secret to your grave. No one will know but us, and we won't tell." Caroline looked up. "You wouldn't tell?" "No," Sarah said. "I love you. If that is the life you need, I will let you have it. I will let you go again." Thomas made a noise of protest, but Sarah silenced him with a look. Caroline looked at Sarah. She looked at the woman who had sacrificed everything twice. "If I go," Caroline said, "I lose you. I lose the truth." "Yes." "And if I stay, I lose the world." Caroline looked around the kitchen. The peeling paint, the poverty, the harsh reality of being black in the South. Then she looked at her mother's hands. "I can't go back," Caroline whispered. "I can't sit in a parlor and drink tea and know that I am a lie. I can't look in the mirror and not see the star." She reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "I'm staying." The legal proceedings were brief, brutal, and public. Agent Freeman filed the petition in the Burke County Court. Caroline Margaret Grantham versus Charles Grantham. The courtroom was packed. The scandal was delicious to the locals, a fall from grace so spectacular it satisfied the bitter envy of the neighbors. Sarah testified. She told the story of the birth, the death that wasn't a death, the nursing. Thomas testified. He showed his shoulder to the jury. Dr. Patterson's widow testified, reading from the damning journal. And then Caroline took the stand. She sat in the witness chair, dressed in black. She looked at the jury, 12 white men who stared at her with a mixture of lust and revulsion. "State your name," the judge said. Caroline took a breath. She looked at Charles Grantham, who was sitting at the defense table, his head in his hands. Then she looked at Sarah, sitting in the back row, her head high. "My name," she said clearly, "is Caroline Hayes. I am the daughter of Sarah Hayes." The gavel came down. The ruling was inevitable. The fraud was proven. The birth certificate was annulled. Caroline was legally reclassified. And with that reclassification, the trap snapped shut. Under Georgia law, Caroline was now colored. As such, she could not inherit the Grantham estate. The will was void regarding her. The property, the money, the land, all of it reverted to Charles Grantham's next of kin, his cousins in Virginia. Caroline left the courthouse with nothing. No dowry, no trust fund, no family name. She walked out onto the steps, blinking in the sunlight. The crowd parted around her, people pulling back their skirts as if she were contagious. She had walked into that building a lady. She walked out a pariah. But at the bottom of the steps, Sarah was waiting, and Thomas. Caroline walked down to them. She had lost a fortune, but she had gained a reflection. "Ready?" Thomas asked. He held out his arm, not as a servant offering support, but as a brother offering an escort. Caroline took it. "Ready," she said. They left Burke County that evening. They took the train to Savannah. They didn't look back at the White House on the hill. They didn't look back at the shuttered windows or the red clay that held so many secrets. In Savannah, life was not a fairy tale. It was hard. Caroline, the girl who had learned Latin and piano, learned to scrub floors. She learned to wash sheets in boiling water until her hands were red and raw. She learned what it meant to be invisible to the people she used to dine with. She saw her old friends on the street sometimes, girls she had gone to seminary with. They looked through her. They didn't see Caroline. They saw a colored washerwoman, and their eyes slid past her without recognition. Sarah used the restitution money, a small sum wrung from Grantham before he fled to Texas, to buy a small house near the docks. It had 3 rooms, a tin roof, a small garden where she grew herbs. It wasn't the Grantham Estate. It was better. It was theirs. On Sunday evenings, they would sit on the porch. Thomas would read the newspaper aloud. Sarah would mend clothes. Caroline would watch the sunset over the river. They were a strange family, a mother who looked like a servant, a son who looked like a dock worker, a daughter who looked like a duchess but worked like a mule. But the silence was gone. One evening, years later, Caroline sat with Sarah in the garden. The air was thick with the smell of jasmine and the distant sound of the ships leaving the harbor. "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked. "The big house, the easy life." Caroline looked down at her hands. They were rough now, calloused. "I miss the softness of it," Caroline admitted. "I miss not being tired, but then I remember the silence. I remember how quiet that house was, how cold." She looked at Sarah. "I would rather be tired and know who I am," she said, "than be rested and be a ghost." Sarah smiled. She reached out and touched Caroline's shoulder, the left one, where the star was hidden beneath the cotton dress. "We are not ghosts," Sarah said, "not anymore." The story of the Grantham estate faded into obscurity. The house eventually burned down in 1890, struck by lightning, consuming the ledgers and the portraits and the empty nursery in a final purification of fire. But the story of Sarah Hayes remained. It was passed down, not in books but in blood. It was a legacy of fear, yes, but it was also a legacy of survival. The fear was the lie, the survival was the truth. And in the end, when the autopsy of history is complete, when the skin is peeled back and the bones are exposed, that is all that remains. Not the money, not the titles, not the white pillars holding up a rotting roof. Only the truth. Paper fades, ink blurs. But blood remembers everything.